For more than a decade, Iraq lived under a shadow. Sanctions, surveillance, and near-total isolation had crippled the nation. But by the early 2000s, the pressure was no longer just economic, it was military. The distant drums of war were growing louder, beating a rhythm that seemed unstoppable. This is the story of the final, turbulent road to war, and the story of Saddam Hussein's last stand before the fateful invasion of 2003. It's a tale of high-stakes diplomacy, fractured alliances, and a world on edge, counting down to a conflict that would redefine the 21st century. The world changed forever on September 11, 2001. The devastating attacks on the United States didn't just topple buildings, they shattered the existing framework of global security. In the aftermath, Washington adopted a new, far more aggressive security doctrine, the doctrine of preemption. The focus shifted from containing potential threats to preventing them from ever materializing. Suddenly, nations that were once considered regional problems were viewed through a new lens as potential future threats to global stability. And right at the top of that list was Iraq. The axis of evil speech by President George W. Bush solidified this new reality, publicly naming Iraq as a state sponsor of terror and a grave danger. For Saddam Hussein, the world had just become a much more dangerous place. The policy of containment, which had defined his relationship with the West for years, was officially dead. A new, more direct confrontation was brewing, and the international spotlight was turning its glare directly on Baghdad. The central accusation, the one that would dominate headlines and diplomatic chambers, was the claim that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, or W. The argument was simple and terrifying. Saddam Hussein had a secret arsenal of chemical, biological, and possibly even nuclear weapons, and he could not be trusted to keep them. In speeches and press conferences, Western leaders painted a grim picture of a rogue state armed to the teeth. From his palaces in Baghdad, Saddam vehemently denied every accusation. He insisted his weapons programs had been dismantled years ago, following the First Gulf War. He challenged the world to provide concrete evidence, demanding proof of these hidden stockpiles. His government called the claims a pretext, a manufactured crisis designed to justify an invasion. But in a world still reeling from 9/11s, trust was a scarce commodity. No definitive, public evidence was ever confirmed before the war, but it almost didn't matter. The relationship between Iraq and the West had completely collapsed. It was a dialogue of the deaf, with each side convinced of the other's deception. In a last-ditch effort to find a peaceful resolution, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1441 in late 2002. It was a final opportunity for Iraq to prove it had no WMDs. UN weapons inspectors, led by Hans Blix and Mohammed El-Barati, returned to the country for the first time in years. Their mandate was clear: unrestricted access to any site they deemed suspicious. What followed was a tense, high-stakes cat-and-mouse game. The inspectors fanned out across the country, visiting presidential palaces, military bases, scientific facilities, and factories. Sometimes, the Iraqi authorities were cooperative, opening doors and providing documents. At other times, they were obstructive, creating delays and fueling suspicion. For the inspectors, it was a frustrating puzzle. They found no smoking gun, no active weapons programs, but they couldn't definitively prove a negative. They couldn't say for certain that nothing was hidden. For the world watching, each inspection report seemed to raise more questions than answers. Instead of building clarity and de-escalating the crisis, every inspection just ratcheted up the tension. For Saddam Hussein, this period was a strategic nightmare. He was trapped in an impossible dilemma, facing two equally perilous choices. On one hand, he could fully and transparently cooperate with the UN inspectors, but in his mind, total transparency would expose how weakened his military had become after a decade of sanctions. This appearance of weakness could invite a coup from within or encourage his regional rivals, like Iran. On the other hand, he could continue his game of defiance and obstruction. This would project an image of strength, intimidating his internal enemies and perhaps convincing the Americans that an invasion would be too costly. He gambled that, by appearing strong and unpredictable, he could delay or even deter a war. He chose defiance. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. His ambiguity was not interpreted as strength, but as guilt. To the coalition building against him, his resistance wasn't a bluff. It was confirmation that he had something to hide. He was playing a dangerous game, believing strength could keep him safe, when in reality, it was sealing his fate. As the winter of 2003 began, the world was fracturing. The momentum for war, driven primarily by the United States and the United Kingdom, seemed almost unstoppable. They argued that inspections were failing and that time had run out. But they were increasingly isolated. Key allies like France, Germany, and Russia pushed back hard. They argued that the UN inspectors needed more time, that containment was still working, and that invading Iraq without a clear UN mandate would be a grave violation of international law. The diplomatic battle at the UN Security Council was intense, with passionate speeches and stark divisions. Beyond the halls of power, a massive global anti-war movement erupted. Millions of people took to the streets in cities from London to Sydney, from Rome to New York, in some of the largest protests in history. They chanted for peace and demanded that diplomacy be given a chance. The world was split down the middle. There was a coalition for war and a powerful coalition for peace. But despite the global outcry and the diplomatic deadlock, the military buildup in the Persian Gulf continued, a clear sign that the momentum toward conflict was winning. By March 2003, the time for debate was over. The language of diplomacy was replaced by the language of ultimatums. The United States issued its final warning, a stark and unambiguous demand broadcast to the entire world. Saddam Hussein and his sons were given 48 hours to leave Iraq. If they refused, the country would face a military invasion. For Saddam, this was the ultimate red line. He had built his entire identity around being the strong man of Iraq, the defender of the nation against foreign enemies. To flee into exile would be the ultimate act of surrender and humiliation. In his mind, it was an impossible demand. Surrender was never an option. In a televised address, he appeared in his military uniform, defiant and resolute. He rejected the ultimatum, calling on the Iraqi people to prepare to defend their homeland. The choice was made. The 48-hour clock began ticking down, not to a peaceful exile, but to war. In the final hours, a strange and eerie calm fell over Baghdad. The bustling, vibrant city grew quiet. The streets, normally choked with traffic and people, began to empty as residents braced for the inevitable. The world held its breath, watching live news feeds of a city on the brink. The sky over Baghdad was clear, but it was a sky filled with dread. The diplomatic channels had gone silent. The protests had ended. The ultimatums had expired. In the cool night of March 2003, Iraq stood alone, isolated and surrounded. The most powerful military force the world had ever seen was poised on its borders. The invasion was now just hours away. And the final, violent chapter of Saddam Hussein's long and brutal rule was about to begin. Next episode, Episode 10, Fall of Baghdad, the End of an Era.